For years, the world told Ukraine that retaking Crimea was impossible. Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014 and has fortified it ever since. It's a strategic stronghold in the Black Sea, heavily defended, deeply entrenched, and symbolically priceless. Taking it back, they said, would cost Ukraine far too much. That's exactly what some politicians want Ukraine to believe, but Ukraine knows better. They said Crimea was untouchable. They were wrong. Now a shocking and brilliant path to reclaiming the peninsula is emerging, and Ukraine is getting ready to seize it. Before we unpack the plan, we first need to understand what Crimea is and why it matters so much to both Ukraine and Russia. In 2014, Russia launched a campaign of aggression against Ukraine that we now know was a prelude to the full-blown invasion Putin started in February 2022. The Donbass was a key target of that initial campaign, with Putin focusing his efforts on stirring up pro-Russian separatist forces in Donetsk and Luhansk. However, Crimea ended up being the most significant Russian victory of 2014. Putin's forces managed to annex the peninsula between February and March of that year. It all started on February 20th when the Speaker of Crimea's regional parliament, Vladimir Konstantinov, claimed that he didn't rule out the possibility that the peninsula would be returned to Russia. That very same day, thousands of fighters armed with guns and sporting unmarked uniforms started appearing in the peninsula. These were the Little Green Men, likely Russian soldiers who refused to interact with civilians and instead focused on stirring up pro-Russian sentiment. Within hours of the Little Green Men appearing, Ukraine's interim government at the time ordered its soldiers to leave the peninsula. Between 20,000 and 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers evacuated, essentially surrendering Crimea to Putin's control. No shots were fired. Russia now had control of the peninsula. And there are plenty of reasons why Russia wanted that control. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea is now seen as the first step toward Putin's later invasion of Ukraine. Most of the world doesn't recognize Crimea as Russian. The few countries that do include the likes of Sudan and North Korea, but Putin doesn't care. To Russia's leader, Crimea is a sacred place that Russia has spent centuries fighting to control. It had that control during the Soviet era, though it lost it again when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became a sovereign nation. For Putin, Crimea holds great strategic as well as symbolic significance. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Crimea was seen as the key to the country's success. Whoever controls Crimea eventually takes Ukraine, was the general thinking at the time. And it made sense. Crimea offered Putin ports through which he could send Russia's dreaded Black Sea fleet into the Black Sea. That collective of ships would be more than enough to overwhelm Ukraine's tiny navy, which is only around 90 assets strong, and little more than a collection of patrol vehicles, minesweepers and corvettes, according to global firepower. Russia would control the Black Sea. And with that control would come two advantages: the ability to send weapons and supplies into Ukrainian mainland and influence over Ukrainian trading. The first of those advantages is obvious. Crimea was to be used as a hub from which Russia could strengthen its invasion into Ukraine's south. Supplies and soldiers would arrive in the peninsula from Russia before being shipped into Ukraine. As for the trading issue, Putin banked on using Crimea as a way to stop Ukraine from making money. And Putin had a point. Before the war, about 70% of Ukraine's total exports, including 90% of its agricultural exports, transited through the Black Sea. Cut off that transit and you sever Ukraine's economic lifeline. That was Putin's plan when he launched his full Ukraine invasion, and it left Ukraine with a dilemma. The traditional thinking is, as we stated earlier, whoever controls Crimea ultimately gains control of Ukraine. The problem for Ukraine is that retaking Crimea seemed to be impossible. Geography plays a key role in that supposed impossibility, as highlighted by geopolitical analyst Paul Warburg. Owing to its geography, Crimea is probably the single most difficult piece of Ukrainian territory to assault, and therefore the single most costly piece of territory for Ukraine to take back from Russian control, Warburg says. And he's not wrong. The Crimean Peninsula can only be accessed via a narrow choke point in the Black Sea, the analyst points out. That's ideal for Putin. Fortifying that choke point would appear to be all that it takes for Russia to retain Crimea. Any Ukrainian assault, which traditionalists believe would have to involve sending tens of thousands of troops through that choke point, would result in far too many deaths to make the juice worth the squeeze. Even if Ukraine succeeded in such an assault, the combination of the sheer scale of its losses and the shifting of focus away from the mainland that Putin's forces are actively assaulting would spell the end for Ukraine. Crimea might be retaken, but the rest of Ukraine would fall, meaning Crimea would once again fall with it. It's for these reasons that many believe that Ukraine can't retake Crimea. It's also these reasons that have led to some to claim that Ukraine should use Crimea as a bargaining chip during peace negotiations with Russia. The logic seems sound. Hand over Crimea officially to Russia, and Putin may relent elsewhere. However, Ukraine is defiant. At no point since Putin's annexation of Crimea has the country even suggested that it might think about handing the peninsula over. Ukrainian MP Irina Gerashenko outlined the general mood in Ukraine when suggestions of handing over Crimea first arose. Territorial integrity and sovereignty is a red line for Ukraine and Ukrainians, she announced. Translation: Ukraine won't ever give up Crimea. Instead, it will fight to retake the peninsula that it's lost to Putin's aggression. With all of this in mind, how could that even be possible? A traditional assault on the peninsula is a no-go due to the sheer human cost that would have to be paid. By most accounts, Russia controls Crimea, albeit illegally, and isn't going to lose that control in a direct fight. And yet, Ukraine is gearing up to retake Crimea. It's a plan that nobody else could have expected, and one that has only become possible thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. It's the very invasion that Putin was able to start on the back of his 2014 annexation of the peninsula that is ultimately going to prove to be Russia's undoing in Crimea. You wouldn't know that if you listened to the experts. For instance, February 2023 saw Adam Smith, who was then the leading Democrat serving on the House Armed Services Committee in the US, say, "I think there's more of a consensus out there than people realize that Ukraine is not going to militarily retake Crimea." Smith added, "Best case scenario is some sort of one Ukraine arrangement. The real question is, can we get security guarantees for Ukraine? A security that would allow the US and Ukraine's other allies to continue to train and arm Ukraine so that Russia doesn't just do this again once they've caught their breath in a couple of years." Again, the implication is that Ukraine can't retake Crimea. But there's something that analysts like Smith lack, Warburg points out: imagination. A lot of politicians have come in and said the recapture of Crimea is impossible without actually looking carefully at the strategic situation Ukraine is in. What type of war Ukraine is actually fighting against Russia, Warburg says. And when politicians come in and say that it's impossible for Ukraine to ever recapture Crimea, this is not so much a reflection of Ukraine's military capabilities, but rather a reflection of these politicians' lack of imagination and long-term strategic thinking. Therein lies the point. For over 3 years, Ukraine has defied expectations time and time again in its fight against Russia. When Putin launched his supposed special military operation, Ukraine was supposed to fall in a matter of days. Some in the US thought as much, with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley claiming just a couple of weeks before Russian forces entered Ukraine that Kyiv could fall within 72 hours if Putin launched a full-scale invasion. Of course, we now know that 72 hours was wrong. Very wrong. It's almost been 3.5 years, and Ukraine is still defending itself against Russian invaders. With that in mind, Warburg says, it's important to recast the thinking around Crimea. The most important thing when it comes to analyzing the actual strategic situation of Crimea is not to look at the situation in Crimea as it exists today, but instead look at how the situation might be changed over time. In other words, there are certain conditions that, once met, will pave the way for Ukraine to retake Crimea. And if those conditions are met, Ukraine could retake the peninsula without sending scores of troops to their deaths. If Ukraine gets this right, it could even reclaim Crimea without shedding a drop of blood or firing a shot, much like how Russia managed to annex the peninsula in the first place. The first of those conditions has already been met: the flip. We've already spoken about the strategic significance Crimea represented to Putin when he launched his invasion. Russia was supposed to use the access Crimea grants it to the Black Sea to devastate Ukraine's south and cut off its trade routes, starving the country of the money it needed to defend itself in the process. The success of this strategy seemed almost certain thanks to what was once believed to be among the most powerful weapons in Russia's arsenal, the Black Sea Fleet. Founded all the way back in 1783, the Black Sea Fleet was divided between Ukraine and Russia upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia came out on top in terms of what it took from the division, claiming 82% of the fleet's ships. Fast forward to the beginning of Putin's Ukraine invasion, and that fleet had about 25,000 personnel and dozens of surface vessels, almost all of which were headquartered in Russian-controlled Crimea. That fleet alone was large enough to easily counter the handful of patrol ships in Ukraine's navy. It should have given Putin complete control over the Black Sea, only that's not what happened. Lacking a usable navy of its own, Ukraine showcased its ability to innovate when countering Russia's aggression. Using missiles and seaborne drones, Ukraine has systematically eliminated 26 of the vessels making up Putin's Black Sea Fleet. To make matters worse for Russia's leader, he isn't able to replenish that fleet. Since the onset of the war, Turkey has closed its straits under Article 19 of the Montreux Convention. That closure essentially means that military ships can't sail through the Turkish straits and into the Black Sea. That's not a problem for Ukraine. It wasn't about to send any ships into the waterway to begin with. But for a Black Sea fleet that has spent much of the war being bombarded by Ukraine's missiles and drones, it's practically a death sentence. Today, the Black Sea fleet is practically a non-factor in the Ukraine war. Putin ordered the fleet's retreat from Crimea in July 2024, with the Atlantic Council noting that the decision made a mockery of Russia's constant attempts to sway the West with threats of escalation. With practically no navy, Ukraine is winning the war in the Black Sea. That's a problem for Putin for several reasons. He's lost the supposed strategic advantage that holding Crimea is supposed to provide Russia. Plus, the Atlantic Council says the withdrawal of the Black Sea Fleet showcases an underwhelming response to Ukraine's tactics, demonstrating that Russia's hold over Crimea may not be as absolute as it seems. The loss of control over the Black Sea brings us to the second condition Ukraine must meet to execute its plans to retake Crimea, creating a supply problem inside the peninsula. There's a great irony to the strategic advantage that comes from the choke point Ukraine would need to navigate to launch a full-scale assault on Crimea. While that choke point would allow Russia's forces to shuttle Ukraine's troops into kill zones, inflicting massive casualties in the process, this limited access also creates the potential for a massive supply problem across the peninsula. Warburg explains, saying, "The only way to get most of the water onto the Crimean peninsula is actually through canals that have to pass through the same narrow choke point. These canals are obviously quite easy to block and dam and basically remove the source of water going into the Crimean peninsula. Opportunity arises thanks to these canals. By cutting them off, which is now a possibility given Russia's lack of control over the Black Sea, Ukraine can potentially starve Crimea of water. And that's an issue for Putin because Crimea already has some major water problems. In June 2023, Russia made the short-sighted decision to blow up the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine. The destruction of that dam has caused problems for mainland Ukraine, affecting 4 of the nation's oblasts. But what Russia didn't account for is that this dam supplies water to Crimea via the North Crimean Canal. That canal was blockaded by Ukraine after Crimea's annexation, though it was reopened by Russia in 2022. About 85% of Crimea's water comes from that canal. The Ukraine War Environmental Consequences Work Group also points out that 8 of Crimea's 23 reservoirs are supposed to be filled by the North Crimean Canal, with the 8 collectively accounting for 145 million cubic meters of water in total. Surface runoff from the mountain's rivers fill the rest of the reservoirs. Those rivers alone aren't going to be enough to sustain Crimea, especially as most of the peninsula's water consumption still comes from the North Crimean Canal. Beyond the water issue, there's also the problem of supply. Russia uses the North Crimean Canal to ferry equipment and soldiers in and out of Crimea. It has alternatives. The expensive Kerch Bridge, which Putin built as a monument to his annexation, also serves as a key artery connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. But Ukraine knows this and has targeted the bridge several times during the war. A truck bomb in October 2022 forced a temporary Kerch Bridge closure. So did the explosion of a pair of Sea Baby drones in July 2023 and a complex mining operation in June 2025 that targeted the bridge's support columns. All of this means that Crimea is perfectly set up for a siege. Ukraine doesn't have to assault Crimea directly. It can instead attack the Kerch Bridge, as it already has several times, to cut off that key supply line into Crimea. Naval blockades made possible by the Black Sea Fleet leaving the Black Sea could create severe water shortages, also preventing Russia from using the Black Sea to ship equipment and soldiers into Crimea. All Ukraine needs is patience and the willingness to focus on these 2 aspects of the siege, and that brings us to the third condition that needs to be met for Ukraine to retake Crimea: Russia's economic collapse. With Crimea cut off from the Russian mainland and the once dreaded Black Sea Fleet no longer a factor, all Ukraine would have to do from here is play the waiting game. In other words, it continues the war of attrition that Putin started to gradually wear out Putin's economic resources. It's here where Warburg thinks most people are looking at the Crimea situation and the entire Ukraine war incorrectly. The war in Ukraine is a war of attrition, Warburg says, where Ukraine's entire strategy is to lock into defensive positions, hold for as long as they have to, and exert more casualties against the Russian military until, ultimately, Russia runs out of men or runs out of resources to send against them. It's that attrition that holds the potential to break the Russian economy, making it impossible for Putin to afford to keep Crimea. Russia's economic collapse is well underway. In May, United 24 media reported on comments made by Oleg Ivashenko, who is the head of Ukraine's foreign intelligence service. He says that Putin faces a major problem already. Their desire hasn't changed. They still want total control over Ukraine. But desire does not mean capability. They are exhausted, technologically, economically, and diplomatically, Ivashenko claimed. He then added that Russia's declining economic situation makes it impossible for Putin to achieve his desire. The country's gold reserves have fallen from 2,300 to 1,700 tons since the start of the war, he says, with its reserves of Chinese yuan also falling. Russia's National Wealth Fund has fallen to $38 billion from a pre-war reserve of $150 billion. In the first 3 months of 2025 alone, he says, Russia spent about $5 billion on the war. These are serious issues for the Russian economy, Ivashenko says. By year's end, we expect major financial problems, labor shortages, and a potential crisis in energy and public utilities. In other words, there's a deadline on how long Putin can fund his invasion. The end of 2025 seems to be the tipping point. We also can't ignore what Warburg says about Russia's massive casualty count. In June, Russia officially lost its 1 millionth soldier to death, injury, or capture. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says the casualty number stands at 1,045,220 as of July 23rd. All of these lost soldiers have to be replaced, which only places more financial pressure on Russia. Putin is paying his contract soldiers bumper monthly wages, along with signing up bonuses of between $30,000 and $40,000. He's also committed to paying compensation to the families who lose people in Ukraine. Add to that the cost of Russia's massive military equipment losses, as it's spending billions of dollars to replace equipment that Ukraine destroys, and you get the attritional war Putin started coming back to bite Russia. Ukraine can take advantage of these dire economic straits to retake Crimea. All it has to do is wait, with each passing day of the war costing Russia more. When combined with the situation in the Black Sea and the potential for a Crimean cutoff that would damage Russia's position on the peninsula even more, Ukraine has its plan. It's not going to attack Crimea today. Direct attacks against territory don't gel with Ukraine's tactics anywhere. Throwing soldiers into a seemingly never-ending meat grinder is more Putin's approach. Instead, Ukraine will wait. It will allow Putin to weaken his country with each passing day of the war he started. Eventually, the concept of retaking Crimea will shift from the impossibility most traditionalists assume it to be into a viable option for Ukraine. Putin will be forced to come to the table when Russia's economy collapses, and with his position in Crimea already weakened by the loss of the Black Sea Fleet, and potentially weakened further by a Ukrainian siege, he'll have only one option: hand the territory back to Ukraine. If he doesn't, Ukraine's constant use of drones and the siege it may implement will create anger among the Crimean people, and that anger could spell the end of Russia's annexation of the territory if Ukraine isn't able to do it more directly. Things are already bad enough for Putin that the signs of Russia's economic collapse are showing. Desperate Russian troops are now wrapping their tanks in wood to defend them against Ukraine's drones. That's happening because Russia doesn't have any money or resources to provide better tanks, as you can find out if you watch our video. And if you liked this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.